By 1808, Napoleon controlled an army of 800,000 men, and an empire that stretched from the Russian frontier to the Atlantic. In theory, his ships had access to the Baltic and the North Seas, the Mediterranean and the Aegean. It has been customary ever since to make a threefold distinction in the Napoleonic Empire. There were the lands within the natural frontiers, the so-called Pays Réunis, the states ruled by other members of the Bonaparte family, otherwise known as the Pays Conquis, and the nominally independent satellite states or Pays Allies. This neat classification conceals many rough edges. In the first place, many lands annexed by Napoleon and ruled directly from metropolitan France were not within the natural frontiers, whereas in 803 Napoleon possessed Belgium, Nice, Savoy, Piedmont and the left bank of the Rhine. Following the logic of a policy laid down by the Revolution, 2 years later he added Genoa, Parma, Piacenza, Guastalla and Tuscany. In 808 he acquired Rome, in 809 Holland, the Violais, parts of Hanover and Westphalia, plus the Hanseatic towns, Hamburg, Bremen and Lübeck. Oldenburg was added in 810 and Catalonia in 8iz. Ever the centralizer, Napoleon managed to increase the 803 figure of 808 departments and 33 million people of his tightly administered domain to 30 departments and 44 million people by 8 states ruled by other members of the Bonaparte family included the Swiss territory of Neuchâtel, ruled by Marshal Berthier, Tuscany ruled by Elisa Bonaparte, the Kingdom of Italy under the aegis of the Emperor's viceroy, and stepson, Eugene de Beauharnais, Naples under the Murats, Spain theoretically ruled by Joseph, Holland under the benevolent sway of Louis Bonaparte, and the crossbreed Kingdom of Westphalia, formed in 807 from Hesse-Kassel, Brunswick and parts of Hanover and Prussia, which had the misfortune to have Jerome Bonaparte as king. However, there was also a group of territories under military or direct Napoleonic rule that stopped short of formal annexation, such as Portugal, the Ionian Islands, Slovenia, Dalmatia and parts of Croatia and Germany. The most important satellite state was the Confederation of the Rhine, a league of states set up by Napoleon to replace the old Holy Roman Empire. In essence, it comprised all of Germany except Austria, and Prussia, not just Westphalia but Baden, Württemberg and Bavaria. Except for Westphalia and Berg, these satellite states in the Confederation were ruled by old-style legitimist princes who had opportunistically thrown in their lot with Napoleon. Other important satellite states were Switzerland and the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Switzerland was technically neutral, but in 1803 Napoleon had intervened there with his act of mediation, which renamed the country the Helvetic Confederation, and provided a new constitution. Even more complicated were the arrangements governing the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, a buffer state created in 1807 from the Polish territories Prussia ceded at Tilsit, theoretically ruled by the King of Saxony as Grand Duke, but Frederick Augustus never even bothered to visit his duchy. Warsaw experienced a diarchy of a so-called independent government and a powerful French governor-general. The Napoleonic Empire was thus bewilderingly heterogeneous, but uniformity was supposed to be provided by the Code Napoleon and the centripetal tug of Paris, the very symbol of European integration under Bonaparte. Napoleon's way with mystification and the way he liked to conceal autocracy under a show of pluralism was evident in the notional tripartite separation of powers, with the executive based at the Tuileries, the Legislative Assembly at the Bourbon Palace and the Senate at the Luxembourg Palace. Napoleon claimed in 1804 that he wanted to site his capital at Lyons, but this was obviously a sop to extra Parisian feeling, for he made no serious attempt at relocation. The emperor wanted his capital to be a political, administrative, cultural and even religious megalopolis, a grandiose city full of palaces and public monuments. Napoleon had ambitions to make Paris both a fabulous and a futuristic city. On St. Helena he told Las Cases, "I wanted Paris to become a town of 2, 3, 4 million inhabitants, something fabulous, colossal, unknown until our time." Circumstances prevented this, although the population of France's capital city rose from S00000 to 700,000 under the empire. A sober estimate must conclude that Napoleon pulled down more of the old city than he created of the new. His particular target seemed to be the architectural reminders of the Revolution. Among the monuments of 1789-94 he ordered destroyed were the Salle des Mains, where the National Assembly had met, and the Marais Temple where Louis XVI and family had been imprisoned. Joining them on the rubble heap were the many ex-convents where the Jacobin and other clubs had convened. Considerable improvements were made in sewage and drainage and the provision of an adequate urban water supply. But the overall appearance of Paris did not change much. There was the new Vendôme column, completed by Gondoin in 1810 with Chouet's statue of the emperor on top, the triumphal arch on the Place du Carrousel, the arcaded Rue de Rivoli, named for his first great military triumph, and the Church of the Madeleine. but otherwise the dream of a city of Xanadu palaces and Shangri-La monuments and fountains did not materialize. The planned Arc de Triomphe on the Étoile was still merely a makeshift wooden affair by 1814. More significantly, perhaps, there were 2 new bridges over the Seine and no less than 14 highways spiraling out from Paris to convey the Grand Army rapidly to any emergency point. Particularly important, therefore, were the international thoroughfares. Route 2 of the 14 ran to Amsterdam via Brussels and Antwerp, Route 3 to Hamburg via Liège and Bremen, and Route 4 to Prussia by way of Mayenne. Of the southerly routes, the road to Spain was Route 11, while 6 to Rome via the Simplon and Milan, and 7 to Turin via Mont-Cenis linked Italy to the empire. One of the ways in which the emperor wished to emulate his Roman forebears was as a road builder. It was due to Napoleon's energy that the spectacular Simplon route across the Alps was opened in 1805, and the Mont-Cenis Pass in 1810. For all that, the new roads were not of high quality. It took 120 hours to travel by stagecoach from Paris to Bordeaux, and the simple fact that most people traveled long distances by foot was one of the factors in the endurance of the Grand Army. Economically, Paris benefited hugely from the Revolutionary and Napoleonic periods. The continental system eliminated British competition and provided an internal market of 80 million people. Particular beneficiaries were the cotton, chemical and mechanical industries, where the impact of war stimulated new technologies also. The influx of foreigners to Paris in this period encouraged the manufacture of luxury goods. Another, less welcome, influx was the annual immigration of 40,000 seasonal workers, many of whom stayed on in the city in the dead season to form the kernel of the dangerous classes that are such a feature of 19th-century French literature. This aspect of the economic boom worried employers and the authorities, who did not want a concentration of workers in the capital, fearing overcrowding, famine, disease, unemployment, and riots. Napoleon's ambition to make Paris a cultural capital suffered from the obvious drawback that his censorship policies and general philistinism did not encourage the arts to prosper. Although it is true that his impact in this area has been overdrawn, after all, no one was executed in the imperial period for services to literature, as André Chenier was during the Revolution. Only Madame de Staël and Chateaubriand, both opposition figures, are first-rank literary figures from this period, though we should remember that Balzac, Hugo, Musset and Vigny received their formation during the Empire. The Napoleonic period was not a good one for literature, the emperor himself ruefully remarked. The minor works of literature are for me and the great are against me. The oft-cited vast increase in readership during the Empire is a red herring, unless we are to take seriously the idea of a trickle-down effect. There was a huge appetite among the literate for Gothic novels and tales of the supernatural, though whether readers of the translated versions of Horace Walpole, Anne Radcliffe or Monk Lewis were thereby led on to sample Rousseau, or the Abbé Prévost is more doubtful. It was in the visual arts that the Napoleonic period made its mark. All great dictators recognized the importance of visual media as propaganda. Lenin was among the first to spot the potential of the cinema. Similarly, Napoleon had a keen sense of the way an entire triumphalist imperial culture could be inculcated through great works of art that bore a tendentious or subliminal message. He was always a propagandist of genius, and one proof of this is the subtle way he transmogrified the classical revival of the 1790s, originally intended to transmit republican values of self-sacrifice, Spartan austerity and civic virtue, into a paean to his own achievements. The locus classicus was the career of Jacques-Louis David. David was an arch-Jacobin who had voted for the death of Louis XVI, and narrowly escaped the guillotine after the Thermidorian counter-revolution of I-794. In his revolutionary period, David took his models from ancient history and legend. The quasi-mythical figures of Horatius and Decimus Brutus were annexed to put across the moral that one's commitment to the Republic should transcend even the love of siblings, parents and children. But like many reformed Jacobins, Bernadotte is the best-known example. David, when converted to the Napoleonic ideal, developed a huge appetite for money. He therefore took on blatantly propagandist commissions from Napoleon, stressing the continuity between the first consul and the great leaders of classical antiquity. So, for example, Napoleon crossing the St. Bernard explicitly stresses the parallels with Hannibal. And whereas the historical Napoleon crossed the Alps in Riadio on the Marengo campaign by mule, the only way to negotiate the icy passes, the mythical figure in David's painting is seen triumphant on a rearing horse. Napoleon's favorite painting by David was Napoleon in his study. There is a sword on the chair, the Code Napoleon is on the desk, and the clock shows the time at 4:31 a.m. The propaganda intent is obvious. Here is the first consul slaving away for the good of his people at an hour when they are all in bed. Yet for all that he was delighted with this work, and with the famous painting of the coronation in R804, Napoleon was never entirely happy with David. He objected to his portraits of antiquity on the ostensible ground that David's classical heroes seemed too effete and weedy to wield modern weapons. But what really worried him was that the subject of David's studies of antiquity concerned with Spartan austerity, republican virtue, the Roman severity of Cato the Elder, the self-sacrifice of Brutus, etc., were at a deep level subtly subversive of the imperial ethos. For this reason Napoleon always preferred the work of David's pupils, especially Frank, Ois Girard, Antoine Gros and Jean-Auguste Ingres. Girard specialized in paintings illustrating the exploits of Ossian, the hero of the controversial epic by James Macpherson, Napoleon's favorite author, in battle scenes, and in motifs from Greek and Roman myths. Gros was the man for the outright propaganda. His Napoleon at Arcole helped to transform the hard-fought battles of the 1796–97 Italian campaign into an image of effortless triumph by a Superman, while his celebration of the famous incident in Syria in 1799, Napoleon visiting the plague victims of Jaffa, turns Bonaparte into a Christ-like figure. Historical distortion reaches its apogee in Gros's Napoleon at the Battle of Eylau. Sober fact records that Napoleon's casualties at the dreadful and indecisive battle with the Russians fought in a snowstorm at Eylau in R807 were horrific and that his generalship was not of the best. Gros, however, presents the emperor as a kind of Florence Nightingale avant I, a letter, comforting and blessing the dying. Ingres was not much better. His Napoleon as first consul suggests that Bonaparte is primarily a civilian, an unwilling Cincinnatus pitchforked into politics by his country's pressing need. Ingres's Napoleon on his throne goes completely over the top, portraying the emperor as a combination of Jupiter, Augustus and Charlemagne. Imperial fever in French painting probably reached its apogee around Rate Row. In that year the Paris Salon was dominated by such entries as David's distribution of the Eagles, Girard's Battle of Austerlitz, Girodet's The Revolt of Cairo and Gros's The Battle of the Pyramids. Additionally, by this time Napoleon had under his wing as court favorites Pierre-Paul Proudhon, whose sensual allegories were very much to his liking and who was the art director of the great fetes given in Paris in the emperor's honor, and the Venetian sculptor Antonio Canova, whose statue of Paul and Bonaparte, semi-nude, first suggested to the world the lubricious charms that had enslaved cohorts of men. There was a neoclassical empire style too in sculpture, architecture, interior design and fashion where the inspiration was predominantly the art of antiquity or the Orient. Clothes followed the same pattern, colors were dark and materials heavy, partly to produce an impression of sumptuousness but also partly, said the cynics, to supply more work for the textile industry. Men's clothes were still influenced by the Revolution, while the frock coat, tail coat and straight waistcoat gave the connotation of military uniform. In some ways the military effect on fashion was even more noticeable with women's clothes. Hair was piled up high in the form of a shako, skirts were straight and cut like a scabbard, and boots, epaulettes and crossbelts were worn. Napoleon's taste was for the monumental and the classical as a conscious aping of the grandeur that was Rome, but the art of the imperial period was nothing like so monolithic as this brief sketch indicates. The best-known exception is the romantic work of Géricault, but there were other examples. It was in any case difficult to insist on a politically correct art when Napoleon's own conception of empire was so confused. His desire to be a Roman emperor was yet another in the long series of irrational and unintegrated urges to which there is no reason not to give the traditional name complex. Thus, in addition to complexes about his mother, his brother, his wife and the Orient, Napoleon had an attitude towards empire that was irrational at many different levels. Bedazzled by the great conquerors of the past, Napoleon could never quite decide which of them he wanted to emulate. When fusing the imperial and ancient regime elites in France he was Alexander the Great, when crossing the Alps he was Hannibal, when berating his family he was Genghis Khan. Even as a strictly Roman emperor there was confusion, with Napoleon caught between the perspectives of the Julio-Claudians and the Holy Roman Empire. So his campaign in Italy in 1796 4J7 was analogous to Caesar's campaigns in Gaul as a self-conscious prelude to supreme power. But the forms and traditions he worked with once he had attained that power were those of Charlemagne. He made this clear by visiting Aix-la-Chapelle, ancient capital of the Frankish emperor, in September R804, and by adding the Iron Crown of Lombardy to the imperial crown of France, just as Charlemagne had done. The abolition of the Holy Roman Empire, whatever the political imperatives, can also be seen as a desire, consciously or unconsciously, to outdo Charlemagne. Any critique of Napoleon's imperial conception is bound to fasten on the obvious point that this was the emperor displaying delusions of grandeur and rationalizing a much more sordid quotidian reality. Charlemagne and Constantine had Christianity at the core of their systems, Napoleon did not. A cynic would say that the oft-cited names of Charlemagne, Diocletian and Constantine were simply names thrown out to camouflage a basic lust for power. In any case, there was a fundamental confusion at the heart of Napoleon's thinking. How could a man who aspired to be a Roman emperor even pay lip service to ideologies such as equality, or the rights of man, notions which would have been received with stupefaction by the emperors on whom he modeled himself? Besides, the analogy between France and Rome will not hold, no matter which particular Roman Empire we choose. Both the Western Roman Empire and the later Byzantine variety were ruled by men who set limits to their ambitions. These empires remained on the defensive behind carefully circumscribed frontiers, apart from exceptional moments, such as Trajan's conquest of Dacia or Justinian's invasion of Egypt, until these empires fell apart from internal implosion and external pressure from Vandals, Huns, Saracens, or Turks. Their rulers pursued circumspect aims. Above all, they made a very clear distinction between empire and world domination. Napoleon, by contrast, had no one clear aim, pursued several objectives simultaneously and vacillated between them. Already by 1812 he possessed an empire that extended farther eastward in Europe than the Western Roman Empire. Had he been successful in 1812, he would have made Russia an Asian power, seized Constantinople, pressed on to India, occupied Persia, conquered Spain and acquired its colonies in Latin America prior to applying the coup de grace to England. Yet in 1808 the French emperor was blind to all this and continued in his Roman fantasy world. The next obvious step in his imperial progress was to bind vassal kings to him in marriage, which he did. Logically, he would then have to downgrade Rome so as to make Paris the new Rome. It is not surprising, therefore, that in 1809 he found a pretext to annex the Eternal City. The next step would be to destroy the tottering Ottoman Empire and attain Constantinople. Some even allege that this was the deep impulse behind the events of 1812. The problem about unassimilated complexes like Napoleon's imperial idea is not just their irrationality but the way they collide with other complexes. So, to the rational aim of worldwide struggle with Britain for a global empire are added the inherited imperative of natural frontiers, the Bonaparte family complex, requiring him to find thrones for his siblings, the Oriental complex and the Roman emperor complex. It is hardly surprising that the foreign policy that emerged from this mess was itself a fiasco. It becomes increasingly clear that Napoleon's expansionism was a much more complex affair than, say, Hitler's push for Lebensraum. As a result of his irrational motivation, Napoleon had been forced to create a monster he could not control in the form of the Grand Army. He could direct its marches like a master and even knock sense into his recalcitrant marshals, but he could not control the inexorable factor of finance. Once launched into his overseas adventures through a variety of confused motives, Napoleon could not turn back. His ambitions collided with those of the other great powers. Britain could not tolerate natural frontiers which put Belgium and the Rhine in French hands. Prussia could not abide the Confederation of the Rhine. Austria thirsted for revenge for the loss of Italy, while Alexander wanted to play the role Napoleon was playing and was thus in competition for the same space. Napoleon therefore had a stark choice. He could disband his armies and return to the 1792 frontiers, which meant in effect to negate himself and deny his own identity, or, because of fears of backlash from his enemies, he had to keep the Grand Army in being. To keep it in being meant performing a juggling act as between foreign and domestic affairs. On the one hand, Napoleon had to satisfy the French bourgeoisie and peasantry, to ward off Jacobins and royalists, and prevent army coups. On the other hand, having inherited a legacy of financial ruin from the Revolution, he had to make sure the huge costs of the Grand Army did not fall on the French taxpayer. Meanwhile, feeling that his family contained the only people he could trust and knowing of their jealousy and megalomania, he had to provide them with thrones and incomes. Napoleon's empire, conceived in Roman terms in his own imagination, thus became in reality a massive system of out-relief. This is another way of saying that a would-be emperor should not be a rootless adventurer without a proper power base. It was not in Napoleon's nature to proceed cautiously, or to make real concessions to his enemies. Unable to concentrate on any one aim, he still wanted it all, and he wanted it now. He would neither let the Tsar have Poland nor declare for an independent Poland. Aiming for credibility, he achieved precisely the opposite, a reputation as a man you could not reason or do business with. Once again we see the contrast between the mathematician and the poet Mank. It was as if all his logical faculties were expended on means and all the mystical ones on ends. As Napoleon saw it when he surveyed his empire in R808, his first task was to deal decisively with the Catholic Church. The Concordat quickly broke down when Pius VII refused to implement the continental blockade in the papal territories, on the ground that he must be above temporal disputes between his children. By this time Consalvi was no longer at Pius's elbow, so that the Pope increasingly listened to the reactionary Cardinal Pacca. As a countermeasure, in January R808 Napoleon ordered General Mialis to occupy the Papal States. A year later, during the war with Austria, he ordered them annexed. Mialis was instructed to incorporate the Vatican's troops into his command and take over the administration of the Papal States, simply paying the Pope a salary as a pensioner. Pius, believing that Austria would win the war, issued a bull of excommunication against Napoleon. In response, the emperor ordered his troops into the Quirinal Palace, where Pius was requested to renounce his temporal power. When the pontiff refused, he was arrested. Napoleon always liked to play his old game of distancing himself from the actions of his subordinates, consciously muddying the historical record by pretending they had acted in certain key instances without his authorization. On the 8th of July R809, accordingly, he wrote to Fouche, "I take it ill that the Pope has been arrested. It is a very foolish act. They ought to have arrested Cardinal Pacca and have left the Pope quietly at Rome." That this was pure humbug can be seen from a letter he had written to Murat a year earlier. "I have already let you know that it is my intention that affairs in Rome be conducted with firmness, and that no form of resistance should be allowed to stand in the way. If the Pope, against the spirit of his office and of his Gospels, preaches revolt and tries to misuse the immunity of his domicile to have circulars printed, he is to be arrested." Philip the Fair had Boniface arrested, Charles V kept Clement VII in prison for a long period, and those popes had done less to deserve it. Yet Napoleon barefacedly insisted that the actual arrest of the Pope had taken place without his orders, and made sure that all policy documents bearing his signature were couched in vague and ambiguous language. This was of a piece with his general trend towards obfuscating the record in controversial areas. Such mystification enabled him to blame Savary for the D'Enghien affair, Murat for the imbroglio in Spain, and Mialis for the arrest of the Pope. The obvious retort for Fouche to make was to ask why, in that case, the emperor did not simply order Pius returned to Rome. In fact, Napoleon ordered the pontiff removed to Florence, on the ground that tensions between French and papal troops had reached fever pitch. If it came to armed conflict, he said, he did not want to run the risk that the Holy Father might be snuffed out by a stray bullet. The true reason appears elsewhere in his correspondence. It was impossible to send the Pope back to Rome without incurring the risk of consequences still more vexatious than those that had already taken place. The Battle of Wagram was impending. The Pope was taken first to Florence, then to Grenoble, Avignon and Nice, and finally back to Savona, while Napoleon dithered about what to do with him. A Senatus Consultum of the 17th of February 1810 ratified the 1809 decree by which the emperor, as the heir of Charlemagne, original donor of temporal power to the papacy, abolished Vatican sovereignty over the papal states and declared them annexed to the French Empire. Under house arrest in Savona until June 18 Pius dug in for a long battle with the emperor. He began by refusing to consecrate bishops nominated by Napoleon to the vacant sees, stating that he could no longer carry out any papal functions as he was a prisoner. This hobbled whatever was left of the Concordat, for it was a central plank of that agreement that the Pope should preside over canonical institution of bishops nominated by the emperor. At first Napoleon tried to conciliate Pius. He proposed a compromise whereby his heir would be named King of Rome and would hold his court there. In return, the Pope would spend part of the year in Paris with Napoleon, all expenses being met from the imperial treasury. But he abandoned belief in an amicable settlement of the dispute in 1810 when his police intercepted letters smuggled out of Savona telling Catholic canons not to cooperate with Napoleon. This destroyed Napoleon's second line of defense, which was to legitimate his nominations for the vacant dioceses by the back door of the Catholic vicariate. The idea was to get the chapters of the various French sees to legitimate his nominations to the bishoprics without reference to Rome, precisely the maneuver Pius expressly forbade. Napoleon responded by handing out indefinite prison sentences to any canons who would not cooperate and intensifying the hardship of Pius's internment at Savona. It was now apparent that schism was imminent, as also the formation of a national church along the lines of Henry VIII's Church of England. To prevent this, a delegation of French bishops traveled to Savona, with the emperor's permission, to try to get a compromise. The Pope made a few concessions, which the bishops took down in writing, then changed his mind once they were gone and issued a letter of revocation. Things went from bad to worse at the ecclesiastical council called in Paris by the bishops loyal to Napoleon. The aim was to get a decree allowing French archbishops to do the instituting if the Pope refused, but the assembled clerics, stiffened in their resolution by the Pope's disowning of the draft agreement of Savona, displayed unwanted backbone and refused to oblige. The council therefore declared itself incompetent to resolve the issue of institution. The two sides now seemed to have settled in for a long war of attrition. A final attempt to secure what Napoleon wanted was made by Cardinal Fesch at a council in Savona in 181 but this too was unsuccessful. In fury, the emperor removed the Pope to Fontainebleau, essentially, he had lost the war. At first, French public opinion was indifferent to the conflict, but the failure of the Savona Council seemed to many to portend ultimate civil war. Rampant anticlericalism was the new ideological bearing of the regime, but the stark choice this posed between church and state worried that essential pillar of the emperor's support, the notables. They feared a new period of social instability, the resurgence of the Jacobins and possible armed insurrection in the old Vendée areas, but most of all they dreaded that the Pope would repudiate the Concordat in its entirety, including the vital clause where he recognized recognized the legitimacy of the sale of church property. The more ultramontane factions of the clergy were already urging Pius to rescind this, on the ground that the loss of church property, benefices and livings discouraged the sons of the elite classes from entering the priesthood. His personal struggle with the Pope apart, Napoleon's attitude to Catholicism was ambivalent. In his heart he hankered after a national church, where priests in the pulpit would dilate on his military victories as the work of God, and from some docile clergy he did indeed secure this reaction. But, recognizing the power of the Catholic Church to allay the fears and enhance the hopes of the uneducated, and to provide a cosmology that made sense of a frightening world for the peasantry, he was largely content to leave it alone. His general policy was to encourage his proconsuls not to offend the religious susceptibilities of devoutly Catholic countries. The many instances of anticlericalism or sacrilegious behavior were largely the function of other ranks Jacobinism.